Greenland. A place that not many EU4 players particularly care about, and rightfully so. The island in the game has two provinces, with modifiers that severely limit the development of the area, due to the terrain being glacial and arctic. So, aside from a freakishly big polar bear on the north end of the island, these provinces are probably some of the worst in the game in terms of value. This begs the question, why am I making a video about these supposedly irrelevant provinces? Well, in fact, this region wasn't a barren wasteland in reality as the game portrays. It was actually colonised by the Vikings in 986 AD, over 400 years before 1444. Contrary to what is represented in game, some historians agree that the Vikings were still alive and only died out around 1500. Why then at the start of EU4, the game insinuates that Greenland hasn't been discovered by Denmark? And what actually happened to the Viking colonists? And how did the colony survive for so long only to collapse in the 15th century? In this video, we also discuss that Greenland may actually be more valuable than meets the eye, even in the game. Also, before we begin, if you like this sort of content, please consider subscribing, as it really helps us out. Our story begins with understanding how colonisation began in Greenland. Allegedly, the first European to discover Greenland is known as Ulfson, when he got lost on the way to Iceland. Although the settlement of Greenland was started by a man known as Eric the Red. Eric had been banished from Iceland after a dispute, and he set sail westwards. He eventually reached Greenland in 982, and sailed around the island for 3 years, gathering knowledge about the island, and he eventually found land that people could settle on. In 985 AD, Eric went back to Iceland in order to lure potential settlers to the new land, and he called it Greenland, making the island sound tempting to people who wanted better opportunities to settle elsewhere. Once Eric arrived back in Iceland, his charisma and persuasion worked, with many Icelandic people following Eric to Greenland, particularly those who had poor land on Iceland. Despite losing a lot of people on the journey back to Greenland due to the stormy seas, Eric was able to establish a settlement known as the Eastern Settlement in 986. He also later established the Western Settlement. These were the only two places on Greenland favourable for settlement. Eric therefore started the period of Viking colonisation in Greenland, around the time of Crusader Kings 3. Although sadly, in another Paradox game, Greenland is not represented in the game, and cannot be found on the map, with you only being able to see as far as Iceland westwards. Despite the lack of representation in Paradox games, the colonies were able to thrive, getting between 3,000 and 6,000 people at population peak. So how did the Greenlanders survive for so long? Well, firstly, the economy of the Greenlanders mainly depended on their farms importing livestock from other parts of the Danish Empire to have a sustainable food supply. The Norsemen also partially lived off the land by hunting fish, and were able to gain an incredibly valuable resource at the time, ivory, by hunting walrus and narwhals. This allowed the Greenland Vikings to become wealthy from their trade resource, and they sent it to their overlords as tax. In EU4, there is the chance that ivory resources can be spawned in these provinces, although some people on the EU4 Reddit think ivory only comes from elephants and get confused why it spawns in Greenland. Churches were established on the island, and the remains of these buildings can still be seen today. It was therefore clear that for hundreds of years the Greenland colonies were sustainable. Some Vikings even decided to go beyond Greenland and discover the new world for themselves. Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, is thought to be the first European explorer to step on the North American continent. Although there was no permanent settlement on Vinland, and the reach of the permanent settlements of the Vikings reached its limit westwards of Greenland. So what therefore caused the collapse of the Greenland colonies hundreds of years later, and why was there such a mystery behind it? (1408). A wedding took place around mid-September between two Viking settlers who later moved to Iceland. This was the last recorded document we have written about the Greenland Viking settlements. From there, almost nothing is written about what happened on Greenland, and all the records after documented very little about the Greenland colonisers, with nothing being heard from them. What then exactly happened to the Vikings, and where did they all go? Well, Many historians have a number of theories as to why these Vikings fell. Firstly, historians believe that a loss of support and contact from Europe due to the Black Plague led to the demise of the North Greenland Vikings. The settlers were heavily reliant on importing certain tools and resources that allowed them to survive. Without these resources, they had to live off the land, which meant it was therefore far more difficult to get a sustainable food supply. The resources on Greenland, such as ivory, also became less valuable over time, as there was an influx of ivory from Africa, reducing the value of the land in Greenland. This therefore made it less appealing to settle on the island. Other historians also appear to agree that climate change played a part in the decline of Greenland, with there being a mini ice age and it being harder to survive given the cold temperatures. The Vikings could also not adapt to the climate in comparison to the Inuit people, and the Vikings used inferior European tactics to hunt food in comparison to the Inuit people, since the Inuits used kayak navigation and ring seal hunting. The Inuits and the Norse Vikings also came into conflict and attacked each other, reducing the population size of the Norse Vikings. Whatever the main reason, it's clear that at least some of these factors had contributed to the disappearance of the Greenland Vikings. But given the limited documentation, the disappearance will always remain somewhat of a mystery. The exact date of the end is unclear, but historians say it is between 1450 and 1500. Greenland would not become recolonised until 300 years later. So given how much we know about these Greenland colonisers, is the region accurately represented in the game? And the answer is, on the whole, it is. Even though there could be Greenland settlers at the start date of EU4, they are so insignificant and weak during this time that they'd have no impact on the international stage, and were dying out. Given their insignificance, there might be no reason to include them in the game as some sort of state. However, this doesn't stop us speculating about what you could add into the game, in order to make this region more exciting, and acknowledge the fact that the Europeans had an extremely small presence in the New World. The first thing that could be added is potentially to give Denmark some sort of mission to revive the colonies in Greenland before a certain date. That way, it adds a new interesting mission for Denmark, and it could make it interesting to the player. Greenland should also be able to be seen by Denmark, and this would make what the country actually knew about more accurate. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.